This is Revolution Chronicles. Welcome to the channel. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to never miss our history stories. Very short 3-line intro to set the mood before the story starts. The Old West was more than gunslingers and dusty streets. Hidden photographs capture the faces of real people and real struggles. Today we reveal 150 secret photos that history tried to bury. 150 secret Old West photos that history tried to bury are more than just frozen faces and fading shades of black and white. They are windows into a world that built the foundations of the nation, yet was never meant to be remembered in its truest form. A world of struggle, dust, survival, and forgotten lives. Each photograph testimony of truth that the polished stories in schoolbooks never told. Some of these images were tucked away in attics, hidden by families who feared shame. Some were locked inside archives where only scholars could touch them, and others simply disappeared until one day they surfaced again, each one whispering a story that refuses to die. These images are raw, and they cut deeper than staged portraits or glamorous dime novel tales. They remind us that the Old West was not just about legends in cowboy hats or fearless sheriffs, but about ordinary men and women whose lives were often carved out of pain, grit, and silence. Imagine one of these photographs, a young cowboy sitting on a barrel, his boots worn to the sole, his eyes not filled with the wild sparkle of adventure, but with the heavy stare of someone who has buried too many friends, his shirt torn, his hat slanted forward as though it hides not just his brow, but the years of hardship already weighing on him. Another photograph shows a wagon filled not with riches, but with the skeletal remains of oxen and horses, a family standing beside it, not smiling, but frozen in quiet despair. They had gambled everything for land and hope. But what the picture captures is not triumph, but the long pause between survival and surrender. The Old West was built on promises of gold, of wide-open land, of freedom from the rigid Eastern world. But reality was never as smooth as those promises. Outlaws roamed towns, preachers tried to tame them, sheriffs failed more often than they succeeded, and behind the saloons and the shootouts lay the true America being shaped in the mud streets, the sod houses, the makeshift graves dug into frozen plains. When we study these banned and buried photos, we realize they were hidden not because they lacked meaning, but because they revealed too much. They stripped away the myth and showed the raw bone of history. One of the rare photographs, long kept from the public, shows a line of men chained together outside a courthouse, their faces shadowed by hats pulled low. Not outlaws, but desperate farmers who had stolen cattle to feed their children. When times went bad, the newspapers called them criminals. Yet the photo shows something different. It shows men with hollow cheeks and broken pride, men who did not steal for greed, but for survival. And to publish such an image at the time would have unsettled the myth of American progress, so it was buried until rediscovered decades later. Another photo reveals the dark side of frontier justice. A crowd gathered around a tree where a man hangs lifeless. The women in the photo look straight into the camera, some with solemn faces, some with faint smiles, as if death itself had become part of entertainment. The children clutch their parents' legs, their eyes wide and curious. This photo was not published because it cut too deep. It did not show law and order. It showed lawlessness. Accepted as normal, it revealed the mob justice that scarred so many towns, and to this day, the air of that picture feels heavy, as though the voices of the dead are still echoing. But there were also photos that captured quiet resilience, images that revealed the true heart of the frontier. One photo shows a woman standing tall outside a small cabin, her dress patched, her hands roughened by work, her gaze straight and unflinching. She is not smiling, yet her presence is commanding. The men in the photo fade into the background, but her figure remains central. Strong and unyielding, she represents the women of the frontier who bore silent strength, raising children, burying loved ones, planting crops, holding the line against despair, while the myths of cowboys and sheriffs filled the pages of books. Her Story and the stories of thousands like her were hidden from the history taught in classrooms. Buried photos also captured Native Americans in ways that official accounts tried to erase, while schoolbooks told stories of savages and battles. Some photographers caught moments of tenderness, a mother cradling her child, her face lined with both pride and sorrow, a group of elders sitting in a circle wrapped in blankets, their eyes reflecting generations of wisdom. The power of these images was dangerous to the narratives of the time. They showed humanity that governments and expansionists tried to deny. So many of these photos were hidden away or forgotten, and only in recent years have they begun to surface, reminding us that the Old West was not just a white man's story, but a shared ground of cultures often colliding, always struggling among. The most haunting photos are those of children. Frontier children did not pose with playful grins. Their eyes tell of hunger, of long winters, of parents lost to fever or accident. A photograph of three brothers in ragged coats stands out, their boots too large, their hats drooping over small brows, yet their stance is straight. They hold each other close, their faces grave, as though they understood too young that survival meant unity. The photographer who captured them wrote nothing on the back, the names lost, but the image tells us more than words ever could. These children were the West, unpolished, unprotected, uncelebrated. Some of the photos even captured the last moments of towns themselves, ghost towns before they became ghosts. A saloon boarded up, weeds overtaking the street, families leaving with wagons loaded, their faces pale with defeat. These photos were hidden because they contradicted the myth that every frontier town grew into a city. Many failed, many crumbled, leaving behind only silence and the crackle of wind through broken wood. The buried photographs forced a truth that the mythmakers did not want to acknowledge. The frontier was not endless success, but often brutal failures. We look deeper into these 150 photos. We realize why they were buried. They showed that the Old West was not one story, but many, some noble, some shameful, some tragic, all deeply human. They remind us that the West was not simply conquered, it was lived, it was endured, and it left scars that echo even now when we walk through small towns that still stand, when we see the cracked gravestones that mark names nearly forgotten. Photos bring us closer than words ever could to that reality, a world where every wrinkle on a face, every tear in a coat, every shadow in the background carried weight. They do not glorify, they testify, they do not entertain, they reveal, and perhaps that is why they were hidden for so long, because truth in its rawest form is often too hard for the world to accept. The next time you hear a tale of the Wild West, of gunslingers or gold strikes or daring sheriffs, remember these buried photos. Remember the faces of men hanged without trial, women who carved survival from soiled, children who held each other against the cold. Remember the ghost towns and the broken wagons, the elders whose wisdom was ignored, the mothers whose eyes bore stories no one asked to hear. These 150 photos are not just artifacts, they are truths, heavy truths, truths that were hidden because they stripped away the mask of glory and revealed the bone and marrow of American history, truths that now demand to be seen. And so we begin this journey through these secret windows into the past, a journey through images that were meant to be forgotten but refused to stay silent, each one whispering louder than the myths, each one reminding us of who truly built this land. Not only the famous names that made headlines, but the countless ordinary souls whose struggles and sacrifices became the foundation of the nation. The secret photographs that history tried to bury are not just frozen moments, they are living echoes of people who walked the dust roads of the West. People whose stories never made it into the proud speeches or the textbooks, yet their lives were just as real and often far more painful than the polished myths. One photograph, long hidden, shows a row of rough wooden crosses in the middle of a prairie, with no names carved, no markers, but numbers painted in chalk, each number representing a life that passed without ceremony, without remembrance. The image feels quiet, almost too quiet, the wind in the grass, the open sky, yet the truth Behind it is loud, and it tells us of the disease that swept through frontier settlements, killing entire families before doctors could arrive. Photographs like this were not shared because they showed fragility when the story being told to the East was one of strength, progress, and unshakable destiny. Another photograph reveals the hidden faces of saloons. Not the lively painted dance halls, but the back rooms where men slumped over tables drunk beyond speech and women with hollow eyes leaned against walls waiting to earn enough to survive. In the official stories, saloons were places of cheer and daring, but the buried photos tell us they were often places of despair where broken men drowned their futures and women were reduced to shadows. These images show the raw cost of frontier living, where gold and silver dreams turned quickly into rot and ruin. The camera also captured the harsh punishments that frontier law inflicted when law itself was barely defined. One photograph uncovered from an archive shows a young man shackled to a post in the middle of town, his back scarred from lashes, his face swollen. He was accused of stealing a horse, though whether he did or not is lost to history. The townspeople in the photo stand around watching, some stern, some indifferent. The cruelty captured by the lens is unmistakable, yet, at the time publishing such an image would have raised questions about the justice system, about the humanity of frontier towns, and so it was hidden. History preferred to speak of brave sheriffs and swift justice, not the suffering of young men beaten before guilt was even proven. But among the dark images, there are also photos that shine with resilience. One shows a group of settlers gathered outside a half-built church, their clothes ragged, their hands rough, but their faces lit with determination. They pose together in unity, as though saying, "This building, no matter how small, no matter how unfinished, is proof that hope still lives." The women hold children, the men clutch tools, some smile faintly, though their eyes are weary. The photo was not widely shared because it did not fit the dramatic image of the West, yet in truth it reveals more about the frontier spirit than any staged painting. It shows how ordinary people carved out meaning through faith, through community, through sheer will. There is another buried photograph of an African-American cowboy standing beside his horse, his boots dusty, his rope coiled at his side, his expression calm, steady, proud, while dime novels and early films ignored or erased the role of black cowboys. This single photo contradicts the myth, his presence undeniable, his stance equal to any man who rode the trails. The fact that this photo was hidden is no surprise. The mythmakers of the time had no place for stories that complicated their vision of the West, yet reality was never simple. And the rediscovered photograph forces us to acknowledge the diversity that truly shaped the frontier. And then there are the photos of towns at the height of their chaos. One striking image shows a main street in Kansas after a shootout, the ground littered with broken glass windows, shattered men lying in the dust, while others dragged bodies toward wagons. The photo was too violent to be shared widely. It stripped away the glamour of gunfights, showing instead the grief and destruction left behind when tempers and whiskey clashed. The myth of the quick-draw hero was easier to digest than the truth that bullets left children, fatherless wives, widowed, and towns scarred for years. Some photos take us even deeper into the private corners of life's places. History almost never records a family sitting for a portrait in their sod house, the walls literally made of dirt, the floor uneven, the father holding a worn Bible, the mother cradling a baby with eyes too tired to stay open, the older children lined up solemn, each wearing clothes passed down again and again. The photograph radiates silence, but it also radiates truth. This was the life of thousands of families, not glamorous, not legendary, but heavy with endurance. When history tried to bury such photos, it was burying the quiet stories that kept the West alive. There are also images of native leaders taken not in glory, but in captivity. One heartbreaking photo shows a chief seated with shackles at his ankles, his gaze fixed straight into the camera, proud even in defeat. Behind him, soldiers stand rigid, their faces blurred by Sunlight. The photograph was not widely seen because it revealed conquest in its cruelest form. It stripped away the language of treaties and destiny and revealed chains on human beings. This image remained locked in collections because it told a Tessiday story that powerful voices preferred to erase. Yet once uncovered, it demands recognition. It demands that we acknowledge the cost paid by those who were here long before the frontier opened in. Another hidden photograph. A group of Chinese laborers pose beside the wooden trestles of a nearly finished railroad, their bodies lean, their faces expressionless. Their hands roughened by endless days of labor. They were the invisible builders of the West, often denied wages, beaten, driven from towns. Yet here they stand, frozen in an image that could not be erased forever. The photo was buried because it complicated the triumphal tale of the railroad. It showed who truly carried the weight of progress, and in silence, the men stand as a testament that history cannot hide forever. But perhaps the most haunting of the secret photos are those of funerals frontier. Funerals were not always marked by churches or carriages. Sometimes they were simple gatherings, a pine box set in the earth, men with hats in their hands, women clutching handkerchiefs, children watching too closely for innocence to remain. One photo shows a coffin resting on two planks in the middle of a prairie. The mourners view the sky endless. It is not a scene of pageantry. It is a scene of raw humanity, of loss in its barest form. Such photos were hidden because they revealed the constant shadow of death on the frontier, a reminder that life was fragile and often cut short. There are also photos that capture love in unlikely places. A husband and wife standing side by side in front of their log cabin, the husband's arm resting gently on his wife's shoulder, her expression soft though weary. This image is simple yet powerful. It contradicts the lonely, rugged myth of the West, showing instead the partnerships that kept families alive. Such quiet intimacy was not the story publishers sought, but it is the truth rediscovered through these buried photographs. Another photograph shows a native child in a school uniform standing stiffly in front of a boarding school. The look on his face is a mixture of fear and defiance. His long hair freshly cut, his eyes searching the lens as if asking whether the photographer understood the weight of what was happening. This image was not meant to be widely shared at the time. It revealed the painful assimilation forced on generations of children who were stripped from their families, their culture, their identity, and this single photo captures a wound that lasted for lifetimes. We continue through these images. The pattern becomes clear. The photos were buried because they contradicted the story America wanted to tell, the story of a brave frontier tamed by progress, justice, and heroism. The truth shown in these images was messier, darker, and far more human. It was the story of hunger, of prejudice, of survival at the edge of despair. And yet, within that despair, we also see strength. We see families holding together, communities building from nothing, and individuals carrying dignity through trials that could have broken them. Each of these secret photos speaks in silence, louder than any legend. The tired eyes of a mother, the scarred hands of a laborer, the crooked smile of a cowboy who knew death might wait. Around the next bend, the small hands of children who carried water from creeks and held lanterns against the dark. These are the truths that myths could not contain, and so they were buried, but not forever. The rediscovery of these images forces us to look again, to see the Old West not as a painting of glory, but as a living ground of pain, resilience, injustice, and hope. And as you picture these faces, imagine the weight of dust on their skin, the smell of smoke from fires that warmed cabins, the crackle of wooden wagons as wheels turned against rock and mud. Imagine the silence of praise, broken by the cry of a baby, the call of a coyote, the gunfire in a distant street. These were the sounds that lived behind the stillness of the photos, and together they bring the frontier back to life in all its harsh truth. As we continue through the secret photographs that history tried to bury, the silence of the Old West begins to speak louder. The more we look, the faces that stare back from these faded images are not actors from dime novels or legends from tall Tales, they are real men and women frozen in moments they never thought would outlive them, their lives carved into the land, with sweat and blood now caught in still pictures that were hidden because they revealed too much. One of the most striking rediscovered images shows a group of miners deep in the mountains, their bodies caked in dust, their eyes hollow from exhaustion, their shovels leaning heavy against the earth, their clothes ragged, torn by rock and time. What makes the image powerful is not just the men, but the child standing among them, a boy no older than 12, his face darkened by coal dust, his hands gripping a pickaxe as though it were too heavy for him to hold. He does not smile, he does not look for pity, he simply stands, as though he already knows his fate. This photograph was hidden because it stripped away the shining promise of the gold rush and revealed the truth that many miners died poor, broken, their families left with nothing. Another forgotten photo pulls U.S. into the violence of cattle towns. A group of cowboys stand outside a saloon, one holding a pistol, still smoking. Two men lie at their feet, blood dark on the dust. The photographer who captured it must have been quick, yet the faces of the bystanders are calm, as though such scenes were common, as though death on the street was as natural as the sunset. This image was hidden for decades because it undermined the myth of the heroic cowboy. It showed that gunfights were not about honor or bravery, but often about whiskey, debt, or pride. The photo is heavy with silence, the silence that follows violence, when all that remains is the weight of loss. There are photographs of prisoners, their faces pressed against bars in makeshift jails, eyes filled with anger or despair. Some look young, too young, their crimes lost to history, but their expressions captured forever. One image shows a teenage boy, his face bruised, his shirt torn, his hands gripping the bars with desperate strength. Perhaps he stole a loaf of bread or a horse. Perhaps he killed in anger. The record is gone, but the photograph survives, and it forces U.S. to see him not as a legend, but as a human being who lived and suffered at the edges of justice. The secret collection also holds photographs of towns on the brink of chaos. One unforgettable photo shows a main street lined with wagons and men holding rifles, waiting. The tension in the image almost visible. These men were not fighting Indians or outlaws, they were fighting each other, settlers against settlers, land disputes that turned bloody when promises of property clashed with the hunger of families. The photo is hidden because it contradicted the clean story of pioneers working together. It revealed the fractures that tore communities apart before they could even take root yet. In contrast, there are photographs that show kindness, the rare moments when humanity rose above struggle. One such image shows a group of settlers sharing food with a quick croat earth. With a band of native women and children, the settlers kneel offering bread. The native women accept with cautious dignity, the children watching with wide eyes. This fragile scene, captured on a cracked glass plate, feels almost like a whisper of what could have been if compassion had guided more of the frontier. Such images were buried not because they lacked meaning, but because they complicated the harsher story of conquest and division. They revealed moments of humanity that official history preferred to erase. Among the rediscovered photographs are also images of frontier medicine scenes, both inspiring and grim. One picture shows a doctor standing outside a small tent, his hands stained, his eyes weary. Behind him lies a stretcher carrying a man wrapped in bandages. Two women stand nearby, their faces lined with grief and worry. The photograph captures the fragile line between life and death. That frontier doctors walked daily with little more than whiskey knives and determination. Such images were too raw for public eyes at the time. They showed the weakness of the frontier, not its strength, yet they tell us today about the courage of those who fought sickness with almost nothing but will. There are photographs of fires, devastating entire towns. One striking image shows charred ruins, smoldering smoke rising into the sky, while families sit on the ground, their belongings scattered around them. The flames have taken everything except their will to remain together. Such photos were hidden because they challenged the triumphant story of progress. They showed how fragile those wooden towns truly were, how one spark could erase years of work and leave only ash and silence, perhaps the most heartbreaking of the secret. Photos are those of Native children captured after being taken from their families. One photograph shows a group of boys, their hair cut short, their clothes stiff, their expressions blank. They stand in rows in front of a government school building. Behind them, the windows stare like watchful eyes. The children's faces are quiet, but the loss in their eyes is thunderous. This photo was hidden because it revealed the wound of assimilation, a wound carved into generations who were forced to forget who they were. It is not just a picture, it is a cry across time. There are also photographs of women whose lives were far from the romanticized tales of schoolteachers or saloon singers. One rediscovered image shows a woman behind bars in a small frontier jail, her face pale, her hair tangled, her dress torn. She had been accused of poisoning her abusive husband, though the record ends. There, her photograph tells a deeper story of the desperation women often faced in a world that offered them few choices. Another image shows a group of women with rifles standing guard outside their cabins while the men were away, their eyes determined, their stances steady. They are not background characters. They are the lifeblood of the frontier. Yet their stories were buried just like their photographs. The collection even reveals photographs of Native warriors taken after battles, not posed for display, but lying still on the ground, blankets pulled across their bodies, the faces of soldiers standing over them, cold and distant. These photographs were hidden, not because they lacked drama, but because they stripped away the diest idea of noble victories. They showed the cost of expansion in its rawest form: death without honor, silence without science, without peace. Yet the photos also show joy when it could be found. One picture, long forgotten, shows a community gathered for a wedding outside a cabin. The bride dressed in simple white, the groom in a patched suit, the guests standing close together, holding flowers made of paper, smiles rare, but genuine, captured in the sunlight. It is not a grand wedding, but it is deeply human. And in that moment, frozen forever, we see that even in the harshest times, people clung to love. They clung to hope. As we move through these 150 images, it becomes clear that the West was not a stage for legends, but a crucible for ordinary souls, some of whom carried burdens heavier than we can imagine, and yet their faces survived the silence, the erasure, the burial of history. The rediscovery of these photos demands that we see the West not only through the eyes of storytellers, but through the eyes of those who actually lived it. Through the farmer who lost his land, the miner who never found gold, the mother who buried 3 children before the first thaw, the child whose eyes already knew too much. The Old West lives not in the polished tales of gunfighters and sheriffs, but in these photographs, in the dust on boots, the lines on faces, the cracked wood of cabins, the shadows of gallows, and the light of weddings. In the midst of hardship, each photograph is a truth, each truth heavy with emotion, and each one hidden because it threatened the myths that built a nation's pride. And yet, no matter how deep they were buried, photographs have a way of surviving. They slip through the cracks of time. They emerge in forgotten trunks, in libraries, in auctions. They refuse to stay silent because the people in them demand to be remembered. They do not ask for glory. They ask for recognition, to be seen as they were, raw and real, unpolished yet unbroken. So when you think of the Old West, do not think only of cowboys and duels at high noon. Think of the hidden photographs. Think of the faces that history tried to bury: the children, the women, the workers, the prisoners, the forgotten communities. Think of the truths that survived in silver nitrate and glass plates, truths too heavy for the mythmakers, but strong enough to outlive them, because in the end, history cannot erase the voices frozen in these images, and once seen, they cannot be forgotten. The last images in the hidden collection carried with them the full weight of the Old West's contradictions, the pride and pain, the victories and regrets, the promise of freedom and the shadow of loss. Some photographs showed small-town parades with children carrying paper flags of 48 stars, banners fluttering over dirt roads lined with wagons. Men tipped their hats as the camera passed, as if they knew somehow that their fleeting moment would last longer than their lives. They smiled wide, though their clothes were torn and their hands worn from plowing dry soil. Those images whispered of resilience, of a faith that even through droughts and dust storms tomorrow would come brighter. But then the lens shifted, and there were darker images tucked into the pile, photographs of unmarked graves on the edge of town, some only mounds of dirt with sticks stuck into the ground to mark where a body lay. No name, no stone, just a rough reminder that someone had lived and breathed and now was gone. Some photographs showed native families being forced into wagons guarded by soldiers' rifles at the ready. Children clutched ragged blankets, their mothers staring ahead with faces carved from sorrow. These photos were not meant to inspire, they were meant to vanish because they spoke of injustice that cut too deep and a wound that time never fully closed. The pile also revealed images of women who, history forgot, standing in front of half-built churches they looked into. The camera with fire in their eyes, they had carried families across deserts and buried children along trails they ran, boarding houses and stitched flags and mended wounds of strangers in mining towns. Their names seldom appeared in newspapers. But here they were, standing tall, refusing to be erased. Their faces were stern, but proud, the lines etched around their mouths, not just from worry, but from survival. Those photos were perhaps the most powerful. They spoke, without words, saying, "We were here, we mattered." Among the most haunting was a photo of an outlaw's hanging, taken moments after the rope tightened. His body still swayed as a crowd stood, frozen, hats some praying, some smirking. Children were there too, perched on their father's shoulders, as if death was a carnival show. The photographer had risked his own neck to capture the moment, and yet the image never made it to the public eye because it revealed too much about the cruelty of frontier justice. It was not just a punishment, it was a spectacle. These images showed us the Old West was not made only of heroes, but also of people who took grim satisfaction in another man's end. Then came a photograph, unlike any other. It showed a single man standing in the open plain, no town, no family, no horse, just a wide hat, a long rifle, and a horizon stretching forever behind him. The sun set low, turning the sky into a sea of fire. He stood like a sentinel, alone yet unbroken. The photo seemed to capture the very spirit of the frontier, not in the gunfights, not in the gold rush, not in the parades or dances, but in the quiet, lonely endurance of one man against the endless land. That image, more than any, spoke of what the Old West truly was, a place of hardship and beauty, of solitude and courage. And as the final photos passed through our eyes, the weight of it all pressed heavy. These 150 images told the story that official history books never dared. They showed laughter and cruelty, triumph and loss. They showed the beauty of simple moments and the brutality of forgotten truths. They revealed that behind every legend and every tall tale, there were real men and women who carried burdens too heavy to be sung around campfires. They showed that the Old West was not a single story, but 1,000 voices layered together and too often silenced now. Uncovered, these rare photographs remind us that history cannot stay buried forever, even when hidden in dusty attics, locked away in archives, or forgotten in fading trunks. The truth waits. It waits to be seen, to be remembered, to be honored. These secret images bring us closer to the heartbeat of the past, closer to the men and women who carved a life out of wilderness, closer to the truth that history tried to bury but could never destroy. And as you look at these faces, remember they once looked back into the lens, knowing perhaps that one day someone like you would see them, and in that moment, their stories would live again.